It's my great pleasure to introduce our three distinguished speakers, each of whom will address a perspective on the Hamas-Israel War. Mr. Rodger Baker, Professor Robert Destro, all have been staunch supporters of the Mackinder Forum. Rodger is the executive director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RAIN, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. His core emphasis is the multidisciplinary approach to geopolitics and the evolution of international relations to develop mid and long-term forecasts to assist companies, governments, and other globally engaged organizations to make informed decisions. Rodger holds a master's degree in military history from Norwich University, and he has studied and worked in South Korea. He regularly holds exchanges with academic institutes and research groups around the world and frequently travels to brief executives and corporate boards, as well as deliver keynote addresses to a wide range of industry groups.
Let me open up a slides here so you don't have to look at me. And okay, so there we go. So what I've been asked to talk a little bit about is thinking about this from the geopolitical context, and I'd like to play a little bit off of the Gavin article by asking some basic questions of why and what we see. And the first question for me that I wanted to ask, and I want to approach from a geopolitical perspective, is why is Gaza Gaza? Why is it there? Why do we have this one chunk of Palestinian territory separated from the rest of the Palestinian territory? What is its origin? How do we understand that in historical geopolitical terms? And if we can understand its origin, perhaps that can help as we think forward to, once this particular phase of the conflict is over, what are the potentials or possibilities beyond that? And it goes back, basically, we have to go back to the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And look at malaria, and look at malaria in what was Palestine at the time, and the areas of high malaria versus the areas of low malaria. And malaria was the bane of many foreign entities that were moving through the area, whether it be the Germans, whether it be the British. The malaria, there are some suggestions that had the British forces not managed to at least temporarily control malaria where they were basing, the outcome of the British and Turkish conflict would have been far different. So when we look at the map of Palestine in the 1920s, and we look at the areas of enlarged spleen, or areas of high malaria, those are areas that, as the early Zionist movement was coming back into Israel, they were much more able to purchase those lands because they were largely unoccupied and largely unused. And so they moved into those areas in a much greater rate than they moved into some of the other parts of what was Palestine at the time. Then in around 1900 or 1920, 1921, the Zionist movement helped bring in Dr. Israel Jacob Kligler, and he began a very concerted effort to control and ultimately eradicate malaria throughout Israel, so that by 1967-68, malaria was eradicated. But as we can see in the maps, the lingering realities of those high malaria versus low malaria areas continued apace. And so the map of settlements, the map of suggested UN partition, when we compare it today to today's population density, and you look at it against, say, what we see for your typical rainfall within Israel, and then that center map right there gives us a look at the malaria areas and the early settlement areas by the returning Israelis. What we see is a very clear pattern that became the physical structure. Gaza, sitting in a drier part of the coastal plain, had a lower malaria problem The Palestinians didn't sell their land. They occupied that space. It was a heavily occupied space, and therefore it had less settlement, and that lingers. So although the idea that malaria has been controlled since the late 1960s, the physical pattern that it left remains as we look at this space. And so that piece of history, I think, is important as we think about it from looking at geography, looking at technology that allowed basically overcoming of malaria. I mean, it was pretty basic technology. It was killifish and oil, and making sure water moved rather than was stagnant. And it was information sharing and things of that sort to be able to overcome that. But that lingering geographic reality still sits there, and that makes any future dynamic particularly complicated for future settlement. Jumping to the next phase, looking at modern Israel in regards to its geopolitical concerns with militant groups and organizations that come either out of the Palestinians or out of other regional Arab or Islamic groupings. We see obviously Hamas has taken a stronghold in that Gaza Strip. We have Hezbollah up to the north that continues to exert pressure from Lebanon onto Israel. And then there are several other groups, whether we're talking about the Houthis in Yemen, or going back, thinking about some of the groups that we see in Iraq or in Syria that are largely supported by Iran as a lever against Israel. This puts Israel in a physically, geopolitically, physically difficult situation. It's got militant groups within its territory, around its periphery. The support base and the supply lines for those groups come from far distances, and therefore the defense and security dynamics usually end up reflecting that. And I will assume that the Admiral will be addressing more of the actual military geostrategic dynamics here. But as we think about that, Israel faces multiple geographic fronts. It has an internal front in the West Bank, it has an internal front in Gaza, and it has an external internal front in the north in Lebanon with Hezbollah. And those are shaping the way in which Israel perceives the threat, and in which Israel then perceives the options that it has for retaliation. As we move to the more regional dynamic, one of the things that we've been looking at in the region over the last several years has been a shift in the perception of Israel amongst many of the Arab states, and that we do have a normalization process with Israel that's underway, whether formally or informally, that is shifting that dynamic. In part, that's supported by the United States, that has taken a different view of this region than it had during the Cold War, and we'll get to that in a moment as to how the geopolitics of the region are shifting and changing compared to that time. But it pits Israel and the Arab states largely against Iran and some of its allies in Syria and its connections through Iraq. And that is a dynamic that was underway, that was disrupted by this current action by Hamas. Whether that was part of the intention of Hamas and Iran to undermine normalization, whether it was a secondary issue, it has certainly delayed that dynamic. That normalization was a key initiative that the United States was also backing as a way to better integrate regional security in controlling and containing and constraining Iran, and thus in many ways reducing the necessity of the United States to play a very significant role in the region and allowing the United States to ease up some of its position and some of its within that area. If we think about the United States and its support for Israel, you can see, if you think about arms support for Israel, that it's very high during periods of conflict. It's pretty steady but relatively high during other periods of time. But go back to the U.S. relationship with Israel, and it's not a relationship that has been around for all time. So originally, the relationship between the early United States and Israel was a relationship that was driven primarily by missionaries and others who were looking at it from more of an ideological perspective. Later, in the midst of the Cold War, it became a strategic issue for the United States. looking at things like the ability of the Soviets to move south, looking at the stability within the Middle East dynamic, and ultimately looking at the balance within the region later on issues of oil and oil supplies and things of that sort. In the United States, particularly in the post-Cold War era, social support for Israel has been waning because, as we've seen in the United States, particularly in the last, say, 8 to 15 years, the U.S. citizens have moved back towards a much more continentalist approach rather than an internationalist approach and viewpoint for the United States, and therefore less support for many countries abroad. And Israel is finding itself within that space. We can also look at the overall perception of where does the Middle East fit in U.S. strategic priorities when it thinks geopolitically. When the United States is looking internationally at all of the myriad issues that it must deal with or that it feels compelled to deal with, the placement of the Middle East has shifted dramatically. In part, that's because of the shale revolution in the United States that's changed that. In part, it's because we're seeing that critical events that occur do not necessarily fundamentally alter oil prices in the way in which they did in the past. And therefore, as we start looking at the way in which the United States looks at the Middle East amongst all of the other places that it's dealing with, it's taking a lower position of importance or interest. And that was particularly true leading up to just before the 9/11 attacks in the United States, which then post 9/11 strongly shifted the US back to Iraq, to Afghanistan, refocused it within this region, particularly in a counterterrorism point of view. But prior to that, there had been an anticipation that as we had seen the drawdown of US forces in Europe, there was a refocusing of whether the Middle East was really as central to US strategic policy, and there was a heavier focus on the Indo-Pacific. And I think I want to leave us with this dynamic as the United States looks out, that on a grand global scheme, what's happening in Israel is of much less significance from a strategic point of view, maybe not from an ideological point of view or a political point of view, but from a strategic point of view than what's happening in, say, the Indo-Pacific, or even what's still happening in Western or in Eastern Europe with the Russian activity in Ukraine and along that entire frontier. And that's something that the United States is going to have to be considering as it looks at prioritizing its resources and where it goes. And as we understand in geopolitics, yes, the geography is significant, but politics and society plays an important role. And it is not always going to be remaining static. The countries don't have permanent friends, they have permanent interests. And they may not even have permanent interests. Those interests in geographic focus can change. And with that, I think I want to stop and hand it over to other parts for us to move on.
Robert Destro is professor of law at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law in Washington, D.C. President Donald Trump nominated him to serve as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and the U.S. Senate confirmed his appointment on September 18, 2019. As Assistant Secretary, he led the State Department's worldwide policy and foreign assistance programs on human rights and democracy issues, such as free and fair elections, internet freedom, and the growth of the surveillance state. His work on labor issues focused on the State Department and interagency efforts to ensure that business supply chains do not include goods or services produced by slave or forced labor. He was the co-author of Religious Liberty in a Pluralistic Society in 2001, and is a prolific writer on legal issues.
Well, thank you, Roger. That was great. It was as good of an intro than I certainly deserve, and I want to begin with where you left off. You raised a question about where does the Middle East fit in the United States list of priorities, and I'm going to address that in a way by starting out with an apology in advance for not providing some background readings. And the reason for that is that much of what I have to say today is relatively new, and I prefigured it a little bit on this past Tuesday by giving some testimony before the House Foreign Affairs Government Oversight and Accountability Subcommittee. And it was really all about the money involved in foreign policy and how looking at the money involved in foreign policy or the way in which money is used in foreign policy can help you understand and answer the question that Rodger so helpfully raised. Where do we fit in American foreign policy? Today, given my involvement in three particular regions right now, the Middle East, West Africa, and the Caribbean, I'm beginning to see some commonalities and some themes that I saw when I was in the State Department, but now it's pretty clear to me that if we're going to look at American diplomacy, at least, we also have to look very seriously at what may be called the practitioner, the diplomacy of those who might be called the practitioners of the rule-based international order. Okay, so let me begin. I was asked to talk about diplomacy, and so I thought I would start with, as lawyers often do, start with a definition. And the Oxford English Dictionary says that diplomacy is the management of international relations by negotiation, the method by which these relationships are adjusted and managed by ambassadors and envoys, the business or art of the diplomatist, the skill or addressing in the conduct of international relations. So there's three elements to that definition. The first is negotiation as a tool for managing international relations. The second is the role of ambassadors and envoys in articulating desired outcomes and by developing negotiating strategies that sets the stage to achieve those outcomes. And then the business or art of the diplomats who are responsible for achieving measurable outcomes. And I underscore measurable in this regard. So from my perspective, both inside and outside the State Department, negotiations are not, at least in the Biden administration, about managing the relationships crucial to resolving or even addressing the dysfunctional relationship at the center of the Israel-Hamas war. That is the relationship between Israelis and their Palestinian neighbors. The Abraham Accords, by contrast, were an effort to manage the relationships by building some coalitions. We can debate endlessly which is a better approach. I don't see that there's any strategy. I certainly didn't see any when I was inside the State Department for developing or that would guide the effort or any efforts to develop one that would require input from all the key immediate players: Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran, with Israel. In fact, I would get very strange and quizzical looks when I ask people in working meetings, so what does a good outcome in this country look like? And the answer was oftentimes, why are you asking me that question? And so diplomacy can't really proceed unless you have an outcome you're looking for. The second element, diplomats and envoys are not empowered to engage. I think that's a serious problem. At least in the State Department as we know it today, diplomats and envoys are not given the portfolio they need. They're actually managed by a foreign policy bureaucracy that responds primarily to the demands of NGOs and congressional interventions on behalf of important interest groups. The Brownstone Institute's paper, I thought, was good because it captured a number of these things, especially when it talks about trying to protect Biden from the more sympathetic groups to Hamas in Michigan. I mean, because and I'm going to talk more in detail about the role of diaspora in politics in a minute. The foreign policy bureaucracy has its own agendas and its own foreign policy that's largely impervious to congressional and executive branch oversight because it's driven by money provided to NGOs and international organizations, and it's driven by the messaging that is provided for them. Once again, the Brownstone Institute article was great background reading, and the near universal criticism of Professor Mearsheimer's analysis about the lobby is dead on correct. The NGOs are not accountable to political appointees like me because they hide the information from the appointees on the grounds that it's hypersensitive. I could tell you lots of stories about that. And some of it was passive aggressive, some of it was in your face. And then neither Congress nor the executive branch has figured out a way to get that bureaucracy under control. That's what the hearing last Tuesday was about in the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. And so after the seminar, I'll share with Christine my written testimony as well as the video link to the oral diplomacy. And lastly, there's really no art to the diplomacy of those who are, aficionados of what I would call the political theology of the rules-based international order. It is a ham-fisted approach that doesn't really take any hostages. So let me just address briefly, and Len, when would you like me to stop here? Because I'll just get through these 3 points quickly. I can't, Lynn, I think you're on hold.
That would be fine. Finish the 3 points, please.
Okay, very good. First, the politics of diplomacy. Okay, the late Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, talked about all politics being local. Here in the United States, that's true. And we see it in the politics of the Hamas-Israel War. It's very, very apparent. The diaspora politics is a big deal in this country. And most diaspora are not very well organized. Some are. I've been working extensively, for example, with the Nigerian diaspora, trying to, which is very frustrated by its inability to get Congress to pay attention to what's going on in West Africa. But you're seeing the emergence of the local politics of diplomacy in the Israel-Hamas war in ways that you just really don't see it. You can also see it in the politics of the Ukraine war. So that's a focus, and if you want to see how the local politics of diplomacy is affecting the war, then just pay close attention to the issues you're not allowed to talk about. You're not allowed to talk about the lobby. You're not allowed to talk about how the Ukraine war is actually going. You're not allowed to talk about a number of different topics. The language of diplomacy is really very hard-edged. This is not a diplomatic dance. It really is very much a Khrushchevian pounding the shoe on the table. Either you do it our way or you don't do it. There's no diplomacy except on the edges between the United States and Iran. which is a very big player in this battle. And the question, people laughed back in the days of the Vietnam War about all the discussions about the shape of the table. As we told some folks in Bangladesh when I was invited to be an election observer there, that you've got to have a big enough table so that everybody's there. Otherwise, the people who are not invited to the table will flip it over. And that's precisely what's happening here. Now, whether or not we can do it or not do it is a different question. But I can tell you that the role of that bureaucracy, the technocrats that Woodrow Wilson thought were such a good idea to run the government, is affecting the language of diplomacy. And then lastly, the method of diplomacy is a combination. You have to put in sanctions as one of those methods. You look at foreign aid to NGOs as part of that. And you have kind of a refusal to see how all of these fit together, at least in the Biden administration. In the Trump administration, at least there was an effort to knit together some coalitions, around Israel. I think that's clearly happening even today. But at the end of the day, the real diplomatic question is, to my mind, well, even if Israel decimates Hamas, which I'm not sure they can do, the question is, what does our diplomacy look like with respect to the Palestinians themselves? Where do they go? How are they treated? What does a good outcome look like? And I don't think that the current diplomacy in the region has even begun to fathom that question. And I'm going to stop here and open up for questions whenever you're ready, Len.